We're going to have a look at placing requests and what the law says around those that sort of mechanism in terms of how to go about making a placing request, things to take into consideration if you are doing that, what would be considered, and a little bit about the appeal process as well. The first thing that we need to know about placing requests is first of all that we're talking here about a legal process, and somewhat confusingly, some local authorities use the term placing request to mean other things, sort of internal processes that they might have, where a school might be putting in some kind of request on your behalf, or it's not clear whether, if might be told the educational psychologist has to do this placing request, and so on. So that I think is quite unhelpful, and it can be quite confusing. And sometimes you're left in a situation where it's actually not clear whether a placing request has been made at all. So we sort of need to start with that, which is what do we mean by placing request from a legal point of view? What we're talking about there is that, first of all, it's a parental request. So the request has come from the parent of a child, or if the child has reached the age of 16 and the young person has capacity, then the young person can make the request on their own behalf. But generally speaking, we're looking at a parental request. And as always in education law, the term parent is used to include anyone who has parental rights, and indeed anyone who has sort of the day-to-day care and control of the child. So that would include foster parents, foster carers. It would include family members who are looking after a child on a kind of an informal basis, where they stay with an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent or something like that. It also includes non-resident parents, so parents who are, still the child's parents, still have parental rights or the duty to financially maintain the child, but they aren't the parent that the child lives with. So actually there can be a number of people who are eligible to do that, but it does have to be a parental request rather than one that's come from the child. The child doesn't have that right, and it wouldn't be the school usually that's doing that that sort of request. It's a parental request. It does also then have to be in writing, or in some other permanent form. So in writing is probably the best way to do it. A lot of authorities have a specific form that they like you to use, but you don't necessarily need to use that form. Email is quite a good way to do your placing request if you're sending it in. We used to say, that you should send things recorded delivery and all of this kind of thing, but email deals with a lot of those things. It's got a record of when it's been sent and timestamps and all of those sort of things. So that's really useful sometimes in terms of showing that placing request has been sent. And then the other thing that there has to be within a placing request for additional support in these cases is you've got to set out the reasons for your request. So why is it that you're looking for this particular school? And those are the sort of core elements of the placing request. So in writing or some other permanent form, and with reasons for the request. And it's also important to note that the law only allows you to make a placing request for one school at a time. So you do have to sort of choose, and it's important there to have a think about which school obviously you're making a request for. Sometimes that's really obvious. Other times parents are maybe thinking about a particular type of provision. So I want a a unit that's got language and communication provision or something like that. But there might be a number of those within the authority, and it's not always clear which one would be the best one. Different authorities, I would say, take different approaches to how much they might allow you to find out about schools beforehand in terms of visits or speaking to staff or whatever. But usually you can find parents groups online or whatever who'll be able to give you some information. At least you'll be able to do a little bit of homework before deciding there. But the legislation even goes so far as to say if you were to put in a placing request and name more than one school within that, so I would like a place for my child at school A, school B, or school C, that actually that only counts as a formal placing request for the first one that's named. So that would be for school A in that example. So it's important that you do have a clear idea about which school you're looking for. It also doesn't allow you, therefore, to make a placing request for like a split placement or that kind of thing. You can't say, well, I'd like a place at school A for half of the week and school B for another half. Again, that's not provided for within the legislation by way of a placing request. So again, as we've said, we're talking about placing requests that are for children with additional support needs. And the law actually has two parallel systems for placing requests. So there's one system that is for children who don't have additional support needs, and another system for children who do have additional support needs. Now they're very, very similar in lots of ways. So to all intents and purposes, it kind of looks like a similar system, but there are some differences. So it's important, I think, when you're making a placing request, that you're clear that your child has additional support needs, and that it's that type of a placing request that you're making. If you're making a placing request to a special school or a special unit or something, that might be obvious. But if it's a mainstream school that you're looking for, then it's worth highlighting that, just so that you're dealt with in the correct way. So some of the differences then in terms of placing a request are to do with the type of school that you can make a placing request to. And essentially what we're saying here is that there's a much broader choice or a much broader range of schools to choose from for a placing request if you are the parent of a child with additional support needs. So one of the things to note is that you can make a placing request for a school, but for their preschool provision, if that makes sense. So nursery or early learning provision, you can make a placing request for if the child has additional support needs. And that's not something that you can do for a child who doesn't have additional support needs. Although there is an element of choice there, it's dealt with sort of separately. So that's an important thing to remember, that you can go ahead and make a placing request for a preschool child if that child has additional support needs. The other thing to say in terms of the choice of schools is that legally a unit that is attached to a mainstream school, so this is quite a common type of provision now. You have a mainstream primary school, say, and then attached to that there is a unit that is an additional support needs unit, or it might be a specialist like an autism unit, or a unit for visual impairment or something. That unit, even though it's part of a mainstream school, counts for legal purposes as a special school, and therefore you can make a placing request directly for a place in the unit. And that's something that that I think parents are often told that, that's not something that you can do, that you can't make a request for the unit. You would just make a request for a school, and that the authority then decides who goes into the unit. So if you're being told that, that's incorrect. You can make a placing request directly for a special unit or a separate special class that exists within a mainstream primary school, or indeed a mainstream secondary school. So that's worth bearing in mind, that you've got that ability to make that sort of placing request. And in terms of the providers of education, you can make a placing request obviously for any school that's within your own local authority area. So if you're in City of Edinburgh, you can make a request to any of City of Edinburgh's schools. You're not restricted to that, however. You can make a placing request to a school that's out with your area as well. So if you live in the City of Edinburgh, maybe there's a school in Midlothian or in East Lothian or somewhere like that you feel is going to be more appropriate, and you can make a placing request for a place at that school instead, and you would make that to the local authority who manages that school. So that's there. You do have to bear in mind the logistics of that. So if you're making a placing request for a school that's a wee distance away from you, then you're probably not going to get transport to that school. So have a think about the logistics. Is that something that you're going to be able to manage in terms of getting the child there and so on? So that's one type of school. The law also allows for a placing request to independent or grant-aided special schools, and also to special schools that are in England or Wales or Northern Ireland. And essentially what you're looking for there is, first of all, you need confirmation that that school is willing to accept your child as a pupil. So you need to go through that process internally with the school. And then you're approaching your own local authority area where you stay, and the placing request is made to them. Effectively, you're asking them to foot the bill for that, to meet the fees for the school and any other necessary costs of attendance. And ironically, that would usually include transport costs. So if you're making a placing request to a neighbouring school in a different local authority area, or even within your own authority area, you're probably not going to get transport. But if it's one of these independent special schools or something like that, then the transport costs would usually be included with that. So that gives you quite a broad range of schools to potentially choose from in terms of making a placing request. And as I say, because you probably only get one shot at this, you do want to be clear that you've made a good choice, which is the school that's going to be best for your child. It's also worth thinking about things like where you think there's likely to be a place available. So if you've got two schools that are sort of fairly similar, one of them is oversubscribed and the other one has places, well, maybe you'd be better off making the placing request to the school that you think is going to have places available. It can be difficult to predict that in advance, but if you've got information about that, then that's worth bearing in mind as well. You do have that broad choice, and so you can take what you know about your child's needs and what provision you think is going to be suitable, and use that to inform the choice of school that you would be going for. There is a timetable and a time scale to all of this. So most placing requests are made sort of in advance, and people are looking for a place at a particular school that would start as of the new school year in August, and made in advance some months before that. And within that, most placing requests are for P1 places or for S1 places for obvious reasons. So that's what you tend to find. And the deadline that we're looking at here is really the 15th of March. And what we're saying is that you would like, ideally, for your placing request to be sent into the local authority before the 15th of March, in the same year that the August start you're looking for occurs. And if you manage to do that, then that gives the local authority a deadline of the 30th of April to come back to you with a response to your placing request. So just about a month and a half to come back with a response in that case. Now those dates over the last couple of years have been extended and changed over the pandemic period. So at one point, authorities were being given until the end of May to make decisions on placing requests and so on. But we're all back to normal now. So all of those changes have been undone. I was going through the legislation just the other day there, so we can confirm absolutely we're back to 15th of March as your deadline for putting in the placing request. And if you comply with that, then it would be 30th of April for a decision. If you miss that deadline somehow, or if it's a different type of placing request, so you're putting in a request and you want a place to start straight away or something like that, then the deadline would be 2 months. So 2 months from when you made the placing request, and the authorities' deadline would be that 2-month period. And the way that the deadline works is that if, for whatever reason, the local authority don't make a decision by the 30th of April or within the 2-month period, as the case may be, then there is what's called a deemed refusal. So the authority haven't made a decision, but the law counts it as if it was a no, as if your placing request has been refused. And the reason that is helpful in a way is that it would allow you to appeal, to take your case on to the next stage. So you've got a deemed refusal, and you can go to the appeal stage without just sort of waiting indefinitely for a response from the authority. What we have seen in recent years a couple of times, I don't want to single authorities out, but I think we've seen Edinburgh do this a few times. It's where they haven't sort of got round and they've kind of written out to parents to say, we were supposed to get you a decision by the 30th of April. We haven't managed to do that. This is a deemed refusal, but we will try and get you a decision by 2 weeks' time or whatever it is. And so that leaves parents in a kind of a difficult position where you're thinking, well, do I just hang on and wait for that 2 weeks and see what the decision is? Or am I going to go ahead with an appeal just now? But I might not need to do that if there's a decision that comes a bit later on. So that's not ideal. And you should maybe speak to somebody about what your options are at that stage if that happens to you. Most authorities, I think, are pretty good at meeting these deadlines, though. So if you put in a placing request, then hopefully it would be decided within that period. And of course, we get to the decision. That's the important bit. So is your placing request going to be accepted or refused? And the way that the law is set up, the sort of default is that a placing request should be accepted. So that the kind of presumption is that parents have a right to choose which school they want their child to attend. That's the whole kind of philosophy behind the placing requests system, and that it's only where there's some kind of special circumstances that the placing request should be refused by a local authority. And there's actually quite a long list, however, of different reasons that an authority is allowed to refuse a placing request. I'm not going to go through all of them because that would take probably the rest of the time that we have. But broadly speaking, there's a collection of grounds for refusal that are effectively about how much space is left in the school. So some schools will be sort of oversubscribed, either just through local catchment area kids, or a combination of catchment kids plus placing requests. And once you reach whatever the limit is for a P1 intake, let's say, then there are grounds to allow the local authority to refuse any further placing requests. And most local authorities will have a kind of a system for ranking the placing requests. So generally speaking, if you have a sibling of the child who's already in that school, that would give you some degree of priority. And there'd be various other factors that the local authority would take into account in order to sort of rank the requests. So if you had 20 placing requests but only space for 5, the local authority would undertake that process and give the first 5 places to the first 5 people on the list, and everybody else's request is then going to be probably refused. So that's the situation in terms of those type of refusals. And as I say, there's a collection of different grounds that all kind of point to that same conclusion that the school is full. They're phrased in slightly weird ways. So there's stuff about, you know, having an extra child would have an adverse impact on the educational well-being of other pupils and order and discipline at the school. And that can sound a little bit sometimes like the authority are saying, we think your child is a troublemaker or is going to be disruptive or something like that. But it's just the way that the statute is phrased. It's really just to do with capacity issues that you're talking there. So that can cause some confusion. So just be clear about that. The other thing to be clear about at that stage is that the local authority are also allowed to reserve some spaces. And the purpose of reserving spaces is for children who might move into the catchment area of a school during the course of the year. So you might have a situation where you're being told that a school is full on the one hand, but on the other hand, you're being told, well, we're keeping 2 spaces back or 3 spaces back or whatever it is for children who might move into the area. And that is allowed. You are allowed as a local authority to keep those spaces back and treat them for the purposes of the grounds of refusal as if they've been taken up already. So that's the sort of first category then of grounds for refusal. The other broad category, I would say, is when we're thinking about children with additional support needs, it would be about whether the particular school is a good match for your child's needs. So essentially, that would be one of the things that could be looked at. And a local authority, generally speaking, won't place your child at a special school if they think that they could be catered for, provided for their needs at a mainstream school. And there's a specific ground of refusal that's to do with that presumption of mainstreaming. And that can be quite difficult to argue against because there is this presumption of mainstreaming that's written into the law. It's also, part of sort of international agreements on education for disabled children. There is this right to mainstream education, and that children should only be placed in special schools in exceptional circumstances and so on. So that's one that comes up quite often, and you need to have a think then about, well, why is it that a mainstream school is not going to be suitable for my child, and what is it about their needs that means that it really does need to be a special school in this case. Also, for the type of schools where there would be a fee for the authority to pay, so if it's an independent special school or a special school out with Scotland, for example, then there's a specific ground that deals with that allows the authority to look at one of its own schools and also the cost of that and the suitability compared with the cost of the fees and other costs for the school that's been requested, and the suitability of that school, and sort of balance those things up. And obviously those type of schools are often a lot more expensive than making provision within the local authority. And so again, there's a bit of an emphasis, I suppose, on showing what is the additional benefit for the child that they would get for that additional cost that would be incurred. So we've got those two sort of fairly broad situations in terms of the type of grounds for refusal that might be relied on for placing a request for a child with additional support needs. And one of the difficulties with the timetable that we have is that actually by the 30th of April, even if your placing request is accepted, or if it's refused and you have to think about the appeal and so on, it doesn't leave a huge amount of time for transition planning and for transition activities and that sort of thing. And so it may be possible, certainly we have attempted it on some occasions, to ask a local authority to make a decision on your placing request earlier than the 30th of April, because the child would require additional time for transition and so on. So that's worth thinking about, and particularly, I suppose, if the child has maybe autism or some other condition that means that those types of transitions are going to be particularly difficult for them. So you can ask that question. The legal duty is the 30th of April, but equally the local authority has legal duties in terms of transition planning that sort of start about a year before the transition is due to take place. And so there is a little bit of a tension between those two bits of law, and certainly it might be worth at least asking if you think that's going to be a question or an issue for your child. It probably is a little bit more difficult logistically if it's a local authority school that you're asking for a place at, because generally speaking, to have a sort of an equity and a fairness there, local authority will probably want to decide all of the places for particular special schools at the same time, so that somebody's not getting an advantage just because the decision was made a bit earlier. So that probably needs to be balanced up as well. So in terms of the placing request, obviously if your request has been granted, then that's great. You would have that confirmed in writing, and you can start to make arrangements and transition activities and all of that kind of thing. As I say, usually the fact that you've made a placing request is going to mean that you wouldn't be entitled to transport. So you would want to have a think about what arrangements you're going to put in place for getting your child to the school, or if you're going to be asking the local authority for transport because there's special circumstances that apply or whatever, then you really need to be doing that probably as a matter of urgency as quickly as possible, so that doesn't become an issue later on. If, on the other hand, the placing request has been refused, then you would be looking at potentially exercising a right of appeal against that refusal. And as things stand, there is a sort of a twin track. So there's two different appeal systems again, and so you need to be clear which route you have to go down. Your letter should tell you where you can appeal to. Local authorities don't always get that right 100% of the time. So I just outline the system. So the Education Appeal Committee, which is run locally by each local education authority, is the place where placing requests for children who don't have additional support needs are heard. And that would also be the case for many placing requests for children with additional support needs. So if your placing request is for a mainstream school, then it's probably the Education Appeal Committee who are going to hear your appeal. Unless that child also has a coordinated support plan, or the authority have decided that they should have a coordinated support plan, but they haven't opened one yet, so you're in that process. Or the authority are in the process of deciding whether the child needs a CSP or not, but that decision hasn't been made. Or final one, or the local authority have said that the child doesn't require a CSP, and that decision is being appealed to the tribunal. So if any one of those things applies, then even though it's a placing request to a mainstream school, then it would go to the tribunal instead of to the appeal committee. But if there isn't a CSP and there's no CSP being considered or whatever, then it would be the Education Appeal Committee that are looking at that. So the other option is if you've made a placing request to a special school, or it's a mainstream school and one of those things about a CSP applies as well, then your placing request is going to be heard, the appeal rather for the placing request would be heard by the tribunal. And it's specifically, it's the Health and Education Chamber of the First Tier Tribunal for Scotland who hear those appeals. It's a specialist body that hears those appeals. The one exception to that, so if you've made a placing request for a special school, but you're not currently part of the state system, okay, so if you are educating your child at home, you're doing home education, or you've got your child in an independent school and because of parental choice, then that means that your appeal would go to the appeal committee for a placing request to a special school rather than to the tribunal. That's quite unusual. That doesn't happen very often. So that is something that you need to bear in mind if you're not currently within the system. You can still make a placing request and you can still have your appeal and so on, but there is this slightly different routes there. And I'm just being reminded, I think by Mel or Sophie, that when we're talking about if it's a placing request for a special school, remember that includes the special units that are part of a mainstream primary school, for example, and the special classes and so on as well. So that type of placing request would also go to the tribunal for determination. So the appeal committee, if that's the route that you're going down, is made up usually of 3 people. It can be 5 or 7 in some circumstances. I've never seen a 7-person education appeal committee. I've seen 1 or 2 5s. Usually it's 3, and it's a mix of local elected councillors and parent members, usually people who sit on parent councils or that sort of thing. So a mix of parent members and councillors. Sometimes you also get people who know about education locally, so sort of retired head teachers and that sort of thing that can sit on these kind of panels as well. So there isn't necessarily any specialist knowledge within there about additional support needs. And it's not a legally qualified body either. So if they're taking legal advice, it will be from the council's solicitors and so on. So it isn't an independent body in the same way that the tribunal is, but you can get some fairly independently minded people sitting on it. So just because it's going to the council's education appeal committee doesn't mean that you're not necessarily going to get a fair hearing or anything like that. I think the people who sit on these do try and play them with a fairly straight bat and to sort of act fairly and do take a decision that sort of fits the evidence and so on. So that's a good thing. The tribunal, by contrast, is a specialist body. So the specialist members on the tribunal are selected because of their experience of working with children with additional support needs. And then there is a legally qualified chair as well. So 2 specialist members and 1 legal member, a 3-person tribunal again, who would hear that case. So you've got specialist and non-specialist and legally qualified and a lay body on the other side. I don't think there's necessarily one that's better than another. And they're just different routes. Sometimes parents are like, well, how do I engineer a situation where my case is going to go to the tribunal instead of the appeal committee? I don't think that's necessarily something that you would go out of your way to do. I think you just sort of have to approach these things slightly differently. The time limits for appeal are different. So if you're appealing to the appeal committee, it's a 28-day time limit. You've got to get your appeal in. If you're appealing to the tribunal, it's a 2-month deadline. But either way, if you're talking about this type of appeal and it's the 30th of April before you get your decision, you're going to want to put it in as soon as possible anyway. So, there's no merit really to hanging around for 2 months, wait until the last minute to put your appeal in. And then obviously we're in a situation where a lot of the school staff and the witnesses and so on won't be available during the summer holiday period. So you're in quite a short window in May and June when the appeals can realistically be heard. And both the education appeal committees and the tribunal do their best to schedule appeals in a way that gets them heard within that period. To give yourself the best chance, so I think you want to be putting in your appeal just as soon as possible to do that. So that's worth remembering. In terms of support for appeals, if your appeal is going to the tribunal, then the Scottish Government fund Govan Law Centre and their Let's Talk ASN project to provide free legal representation for parents or young people who are going through the appeal process at the tribunal, including placing request appeals. So that might be your first port of call. We at Cairn Legal also provide representation services for placing request appeals at the tribunal, but unfortunately we don't have access to that funding, so that's not something that we can do for free as Govan Law Centre can. If your placing request is going to the Education Appeal Committee, then that system doesn't apply there. So the Let's Talk ASN thing doesn't apply there. The expectation is really that you would do that yourself. You're entitled to have representation, but there isn't a Scottish Government funding for representation, and there isn't legal aid available for education appeal committees either. So you would be funding that yourself, or looking to, I think some organizations like National Autistic Society, National Autistic Society, I think, still have a support service that can allocate volunteer support through that process and so on. So you could speak to whatever membership organizations that you might be part of to see if there's something that they can do to assist. But generally speaking, as I say, the expectation is that you're going to an appeal committee, and that most parents just do that themselves, which is fine. Either way, so whichever route you go down, whether you're at the appeal committee or at the tribunal, they're making the same decision based on the same law. So it's the same process that you're going through, and that is that the tribunal will be deciding, is there in fact a ground of refusal? So we were talking about that earlier on. The authority might be saying this school is full. Sorry. This school is full, and the tribunal or the appeal committee will just be looking at whether in fact that's correct or not. What is the evidence in terms of the number of pupils, places that are available, and so on. If it's a question about mainstreaming, if it's a question about does the child have needs that require the place at this special school, whatever, then that's the thing that the tribunal or the appeal committee would be looking at. And again, looking at the evidence about the child's needs, about the provision at the school or at both schools if there's a comparison, and taking a decision themselves on whether they think that ground for refusal applies. And obviously, if they don't think that the ground for refusal applies, then your appeal would be successful. But there's also a second stage. So even if the tribunal or the appeal committee agree that there is a ground of refusal, they also then have to look at, my apologies, my phone keeps going off and it's routed through the computer. So hopefully my colleagues at work will be getting the picture now that I'm not answering my phone. The second leg, so even if there is a ground of refusal and that's been established, the tribunal or the appeal committee then have to go on to look at, well, what is the situation here in terms of an overall appropriateness of refusing this placing request? So they have to decide, is it appropriate for us to confirm the authority's decision in all the circumstances? So that really gives you quite a broad range to look at all of the things that are going on in the child's life, about their needs, about the reasons that you have for choosing that particular school, and so on, and allowing the tribunal or the appeal committee to consider those and to come up with that really much broader decision on appropriateness. It does leave you with a situation where there's always something that you can argue, even if there's absolutely, this school is full and we know that that's the case and it would cost money to extend it and so on. You can go ahead to the appeal committee or to the tribunal and say, well, we appreciate that that's the case, but nonetheless, in all the circumstances, it's appropriate for the child to be placed there. So there's always at least a small chance, I guess, in any appeal. So that's the decision that the tribunal are making. And it's important to remember, we were talking earlier on about the placing request and the sort of default position being that it should be granted. And that applies at the appeal stage as well. So the tribunal would decide in the parent's favour unless the authority have satisfied them that there is a ground for refusal and that it is appropriate in all the circumstances that the refusal be confirmed. So what we say in legal terms is that the onus or the burden of proof lies with the authority. It's for them to prove their case rather than for the parent to prove their case. So that's quite helpful in terms of just the legal framework that exists there. And you would then get obviously a decision from the appeal body, whichever route you've gone down, there is the possibility in either route of a further appeal. So if the appeal committee turns down your appeal, then the parent has a further right of appeal. You can take that decision to the sheriff, and unusually that type of appeal just takes place by way of a rehearing. So you're just doing the same thing over again. The sheriff is deciding the same questions as if you were going to the appeal committee or the tribunal. The sheriff would look at, as things stand before me today, is there a ground for refusal established? What's my view on the appropriateness in all the circumstances, and so on. So that's quite unusual as an appeal, but that is the way that it operates. That is, again, a 28-day time limit, so quite a tight turnaround to get something into the sheriff court. And there is legal aid available for an appeal to the sheriff court at that stage. Timing-wise, you're probably well into the summer holiday period by that point. Again, the sheriff clerks are usually pretty good at fast tracking this type of case. The court's generally very busy. Sheriff courts across the country will be pretty busy with other business, but there is a recognition that this is a case that needs to be decided, before the start of term or as soon thereafter as possible. So generally speaking, again, you want to get it in as soon as possible, but you'll find probably a sympathetic sheriff clerk will be trying to schedule these things sympathetically. If you've the other interesting thing, about the appeal committee decisions is that if it goes in the parent's favour, then there is no further right of appeal for the local authority. So it's a one-sided appeal route for the parent has a further right of appeal, but the local authority doesn't from the appeal committee. If you're going to the tribunal have heard your appeal, then there is a further right of appeal to the upper tribunal, but it is a bit more restricted. So the upper tribunal, you need permission to appeal, first of all. So you have to ask the tribunal for permission to appeal. And if they say no, you can ask the upper tribunal for permission to appeal. But that needs to happen first. And also, it's only on a point of law. So the upper tribunal doesn't hear your case again, and you wouldn't be able to appeal just because you disagreed with the decision. You thought the tribunal had sort of made the wrong decision based on the facts or something. You would have to be able to identify a specific error of law to be able to appeal to the upper tribunal. So those don't happen terribly often. There's only been a few actually in the course of that process being available, and I say so it is much more restricted. So for practical purposes, in most cases, the tribunal decision will be the final decision on your placing request, because the further appeal is quite restricted. If you're going to the appeal committee, then you've automatically got a further right of appeal. If you're unsuccessful, you're always allowed to take it on towards the sheriff. The upper tribunal, again, you can get legal aid for that. So in terms of financing and so on, if you're financially eligible, you can get legal aid to take things to the tribunal. Right, so that is, in a nutshell, we've taken ourselves from the start of the process in terms of what is a placing request, how do you go about making it, and the deadlines. Had a look at the grounds for refusal, and we've taken ourselves all the way to the appeal stage, and indeed the further appeal stage. So that's everything you need to know about placing requests, but we're afraid to ask. Thank you for having me.